What's up guys, it's DoubleZug. So with Toes coming out, we are obviously going to be getting the option to farm lots of our tier set gear from Celestial Dungeons coming quite soon here, as well as obviously just tier coming out in general for raiders who are doing normal or heroic clears. So I want to go quickly over in this video the tier sets, whether or not they're worth it to get at high eye level, and also whether or not they're worth it to farm from Celestial Dungeons for like your previous setups. Speaking of tier sets here, kind of a similar pattern to most expansions. Healer tier sets, pretty boring. Also, healer tier sets kind of starting out way more boring in the first tiers, generally speaking, and that's no exception in Mists of Pandaria. If you remember in Cataclysm, the first tier sets for healers were all like quite boring, quite passive, and they didn't really get too much more exciting, although in Dragon Soul some of those tier sets were kind of cool. The same pattern kind of happens in Mists of Pandaria as well, where the first tier sets are like kind of themed, where the 2 pieces like mana cost reduction and the 4 pieces of CDR. Very boring, low impact tier sets here for the most part. So I'm going to quickly go over these and then talk about how much impact they have before we go into gearing a little bit later on in the video. So we're going to start on a high note with Druid here. This is one of the better tier sets. You can see the tier gear, not like super cool looking, honestly, but not too bad either. The 2 piece is a 10% mana cost reduction on rejuvenation, and the 4 piece is going to be very familiar if you've been wearing the PvP pieces, which is a reduction in the CD of Swiftmend by 3 seconds. So Rejuve being our main filler, 10% mana cost reduction there is actually quite decent, and the 4 piece is 1 second better than the PvP CDR, which I believe is 2 seconds, although not a massive difference there. So how much do we actually get from this? This is just like estimations based on my sheet sim, so the 10% mana cost on Rejuve is going to be like between 2 and 3% healing, about like 2.3, 2.5 estimated. The 4 set is going to be a little bit bigger than that, being like about a 3% increase. So total, both of these tier bonuses are about 5% healing increase. So this is one of the better set bonuses. I think it's only beat out by Paladin, which is I think a little bit better. And the big problem with this here, especially at Raid Finder eye level, which is what you're going to be farming in Celestial Dungeons, the PvP set bonuses are actually very, very strong for Druid. We get the 2-second CDR on Swiftmend, which is quite, similar to this, giving you like, about 2.5% increase. So we don't lose too much healing going with those at a lower eye level. And the 4 set on the PvP gear being a 30-second CDR on Ironbark is just absolutely incredible, especially for fights that threaten the tank. So, in Toes, that's going to be Shaw with Thrash. So if you aren't like super high eye level on your off pieces on these slots, it can potentially be correct to just run this super low CD on Ironbark, which means that unless you are really one of these players that just hates doing PvP, what I would recommend instead of farming your Celestial PvP gear for like a Prebis setup, if you're going into Toes or Art of Fear, and you're just getting your Druid up, maybe it's an alt, maybe you're a new player, I would recommend actually farming the Conquest gear for that 4 piece instead of farming Celestials for that PvE gear. However, the set bonus here is good enough, and the tier rather is well itemized enough that if you don't like doing PvP for Conquest, you can easily just farm your 4 set in Celestial Dungeons, and you're going to be quite close. And really the only thing you're going to be losing there is just that access to the short cooldown on Ironbark, which is quite strong. Also, the side benefit of farming the Celestials is that when you do get higher eye level tier from the raid, you will already have those like 2 and 4 sets activated, which can be quite nice, because for your Abyss setup, I do believe you are going to be running 4-piece. You're actually going to be running 4-piece healing tier, and then I do believe you probably want to run the balance tier on your shoulders, just because it's well itemized, Spirit Mastery. However, you can also, you can farm this in Celestials for your off piece. However, if you have like the shoulders from Garajal, you probably don't need them because these are Spirit Mastery with a socket, so quite strong as well. So that's Druid in a good spot for Prebis gearing, because both Celestials and PvP gear are both quite strong. So either option that you prefer, you can take and gear up super quickly. Whereas some of these other healers really prefer one or the other, or like neither and really want off pieces. Also, I'm going to be referencing these like loose Abyss lists here. I'll be posting a video later on Abyss lists and posting these lists as well, but these are just kind of loose. Set them up in the Sims thing because it has the best like gear sorter. So these might have some weird gems in them, like Agi gems or whatever, because I'm using the Windwalker setup, but don't worry about that too much. Alright, so again, starting on a high note, let's talk about Paladin next. This is probably the strongest tier set out of the whole bunch, and it's still like not super exciting. So what does this do? The 2-piece is a 10% mana cost reduction on Holy Radiant, so similar to the Druid one being a mana cost reduction. However, the spell here is actually quite strong. Holy Radiance is going to be like our main AoE filler / holy power builder. The 4-piece is also a CDR here, which is a 1-second CDR on Holy Shock. Holy Shock having a 6-second base CD reduced by melee haste. Getting a second off of that is actually quite significant as like a percentage of your CD. And Holy Shock is quite a good builder. However, with the mana changes with Seal of Insight, we don't care as much about like how efficient Holy Shock is because we have so much mana. And it also reduces the mana cost value on Holy Radiance a little bit, but, you know, both of these are still quite strong bonuses. So if we look at the estimated value here, it's going to shift actually based on Eternal Flame versus LOD, because Eternal Flame is much more efficient Holy Power for Holy Power, so things like casting more Radiance and more Holy Shock is going to have a little bit more value for EF, because that Holy Power is going to have a little bit more value like per Holy Power. So for EF, the 2 set's like about a 2.5%, and for LOD, it's going to be like about a 1 to a 0.5% increase. And this will actually like go up a little bit if you have higher uptime on Seal of Insight. I think I estimated in the sim a relatively conservative uptime for Seal, so this could go a little bit higher if you're casting more Radiances because you have more mana from your Seal. So for the 4 set, it's definitely a little bit better. This is the strongest part of the tier. It's going to be like about a 6% for EF and a 4% for your like SH/SS LOD spender builds. And overall here, it's going to be a little bit better than Druid, between like a 5 to 8% more increase. So on the very low end, competing with Druid, and a high end a little bit better. So definitely the best tier set here. However, you know, because we're healers, we're probably not going to get primed for tier gear, but again, those Celestials allowing you to farm this are quite strong. So that's all well and good, but would I recommend actually farming this if you have heroic high level off pieces? I don't think it's necessarily worth it. It probably is either a wash or a slight downgrade if you have like 502, 509 off pieces in your tier slots with good itemization. You don't necessarily have to go back to Celestials to farm out your 4 set just for the set bonuses. So that's kind of nice, honestly. If you have been raiding heroic modes, you don't necessarily need to go back and farm these, but if you just have normal gear, if you have a slot that has low eye level, I definitely would recommend going back into Celestials and farming those missing pieces. Also, you know, just a nice upside that if you get the heroic tier gear or the normal tier gear from the raid, you can always have those tier sets activated early. So I do think if you're a Holy Paladin, you probably will be spending a little bit more time in Celestials and some of the other specs. However, complicating this a little bit, very similar to Druid, Paladin has like a kind of a wealth of riches in terms of its set bonuses, with the PvP set bonuses also being very strong. So you can see here the 2 set is Holy Shock healing increased by 10%, which is decently significant, and then the 4 set is casting Flash of Light grants 1 charge of Holy Power. So this means if you Flash of Light your beacon target, you get 2 Holy Power. And a little bit of estimation here, the 2 set PvP is about a 2% increase, so it's actually quite comparable to the 2 set from your tier set, which is nice. And the 4 set is not like strictly an HPS increase, but it makes your Flash of Light comparable to Holy Radiance, especially for EF builds, that take the Flash of Light glyph. And this is just a very useful and powerful thing to have on any fight where like Eternal Flame is good and the tank's taking heavy damage. You just get to do really, really efficient, very powerful spot and tank healing with your Flash of Light glyph, and generate huge amounts of Holy Power, which helps you get coverage on the raid. So again, this is complicating things where if you don't mind farming Conquest gear for PvP, if you have like a fresh Holy Paladin, I would actually recommend, especially for 10-man, farming your 4 set PvP before you go into Celestials to farm that tier set bonus. If you're playing like SH and 25-man, this is a little bit less important, and you can just go into Celestials and get your tier set 4-piece. If you have infinite time, you could farm both. Generally speaking, that's how I'd work it. If you play 25-man primarily, I'd get the tier set from Celestials, and if you play 10-man primarily, I would farm your Conquest gear to get your PvP 4 set. Also, a little bit of itemization difference here between SH and EF. I do believe both specs will be in like their full bis running 4 set tier, but EF will run a little bit higher haste because of the first haste breakpoint being quite strong, whereas SH, you want to be running a set like this that has, you know, very, very low haste, because haste is just less valuable than mastery and crit by a decent margin. You also want to be minimizing your spirit to the point where you still have like hit and expertise cap, but you don't really need too much of it, again, with the Seal of Insight changes. Alright, so next let's do a 2-in-1 here with Priest. So obviously both Priest healing specs running the same tier gear. Kind of nice for spec swapping, which you're probably going to be doing a lot of anyways, because both Disc and Holy are quite strong, and also share very similar gear. So what does this 2 set give us? It's going to be a mana cost reduction, but unfortunately for Priest, it's not on a big filler spell that matters, something like POH. We get a 20% mana cost reduction on Flash Heal. So this is not super exciting for both Disc and Holy. It's a little bit better for Holy because you might cast Flash Heal for like serendipity value and stuff like that in your single target, but generally speaking, quite bad for both. This 2-set's also devalued a little bit by the fact that it's competing with the PvP set bonuses. If you do want to be doing that focused single target healing, especially on disc with Spirit Shell, the 2-set here is going to amp your heals on a target after you palm them by 50%, which is big. This is also quite useful for Sulong as an aside here. And the 4-set specifically here, giving a 50% mana cost to Flash Heal. Again, both of these align to make your single target healing much better, and that 50% is obviously bigger than 20%. So the 2-set quite weak for both Disc and Holy. It's not going to be enough to make you press Flash Heal, so it's not really an HPS increase outside of like corner cases where you're spot healing. So the 4-set really has to carry this very, very hard, and unfortunately it doesn't really do that much for both specs. Originally, the Penance CDR here was much higher, however it was nerfed due to just, class changes, last past first balancing. We got a shorter base cooldown on Penance, and so the CDR here got reduced to only 1 second. So the 2-set here I just estimated as having like basically 0 value. It will have a little bit of value if you ever press Flash Heal, but like ideally for perfect HPS you just won't press that button. So the 4-set here, I did 2 calculations, one with the original 3-second CDR, and then one with the new one, and there's a dramatic difference here, obviously. So the first one would be about a 6% HPS increase, but the biggest thing here is that it was like 15 to 18% DPS increase, which is really high impact. And the similar ratio between HPS and DPS gain is preserved in the 4-piece, but the magnitude of the effect is just obviously much lower, so it's only going to be like a 1 to 2% HPS increase and, 5% DPS increase. So this is very low impact. The damage is quite there, so if you're playing specifically for like damage parsing, you definitely want the 4-set, but if you're playing for HPS, I just don't think this is worth getting because some of the tier pieces are just not well itemized. You can see here in this loose bis list, I'm actually running Shadow Priest Helm because it's crit mastery, which is our best stats. And I'm only running 2-piece here because these are really the only 2 pieces that are well itemized. We have shoulder pieces and legs. The chest piece is Spirit Haste, which both are quite bad stats. Spirit being okay for DPS. The gloves are also Spirit Haste, so again, quite bad with 1 dead stat and 1 very mid stat. The helm piece is Spirit Mastery, so actually decent here. So a good alternative option if you are getting that 4-set. But again, for HPS, I'd run something like this with only a 2-piece setup because those secondary stat differentials are just so big for HPS. Crit and Master are so far ahead of Spirit and Haste that the tier set here just does not overpower that. So with all that said, how would I gear for Prebis? Well, what I would actually do is I would farm these like 3 tier pieces from the Celestials, and then I would just fill in the rest with PvP gear because there's some crafted slots here, but I wouldn't spend the money for those. I would just get the 483 PvP gear, and that 2-piece bonus with the palm amplification is actually quite useful, especially for Holy Priest. Now to really quickly go over Holy Priest. Holy Priest has very similar stat priorities, being like Mastery just slightly better than Crit, and Spirit and Haste still being quite bad, so Spirit being a little bit better. But for Holy, what I would do here is the 2-piece, again, not great. The 4-set here is decently good. Generally speaking, POH is like more efficient than COH in terms of raw, but COH has lower overhealing, so the value of this 4-set, which is a full 4-second CDR and Circle of Healing, which is quite significant CDR. Basically, the more overhealing POH does, the less overhealing COH does, the better this is. On an average fight, I'd estimate this as being about a 2.5 to 3% healing increase. That's, a decent little chunk there. However, again, the bad itemization on the tier pieces being Haste Spirit means that I probably just wouldn't go for this. I'd gear very similarly to the Disc Priest list. However, again, if you want to get that 4-set, you can always use the Healing Tier Helm, and then you'd probably run like just one of these off pieces, depending on which one you don't have a high eye level piece in. And for Prebis gearing, I would do the exact same strategy for Holy as for Disc, where I'd get 2-piece PvP, and then I'd just farm these 3 pieces of tier. However, again, if you just don't like PvP, you can farm 4-set. If you are getting that 4-piece, I'd probably run Hands and Helm over Chest, just because Chest is more itemization, and so having bad stats on your chest is a little bit worse than having them on your hands. Alright, so next up, let's talk about Mistweaver Monk. So unfortunately, this tier set is very ugly in my view. You got like the glowing like puka shell necklace, the weird hat, and similar to its appearance, the set bonuses are also quite bad. So the 2-piece is 10% mana cost reduction on Surging Mist, which is even worse than the Flash Heal mana cost reduction. It's less percentage, and also the spell is just not one you're going to really be casting too much. And the 4-piece is increasing the healing done by Enveloping Mist by 5%. So this is our single target hot. So another kind of like mostly useless 4-piece. And because Mistweaver has such dramatically polarized stat weights, with Haste and Mastery being so bad, crit being relatively so strong and spirit being like somewhere in the middle there, we really don't care about the tier set bonuses specifically for like themselves. We just only want the tier if it's well itemized. And so I think in like Abyss setup, you probably only run like one of these pieces of tier, being the shoulders, which is spirit crit. And for the rest of these slots, you just run off pieces. However, some of the tier gear is relatively close. So if you have high level tier, it's probably worth equipping, but for full Abyss setup, I'd probably run something like this. And this doesn't hit the first rem break point, but you could potentially swap in a couple of extra pieces of tier with haste on it. And unlike Druid and Paladin that have like 2 good set bonuses, both PvE and PvP, we have 2 bad ones. So our PvE set bonus is bad and our PvP set bonus is also bad, with the 2 set just being like you get something from Dispelling, which never happens in PvE, and also the 4 set being just like your Aura Mastery from TFT, which doesn't matter either. Basically what you're doing here for Pre-Bis is you're just, if you like PvP, you can farm some of the pieces that give you good stats. And then for Celestials, you're just going to be buying the off pieces that have Spirit and Crit on them. You can potentially just farm some of your tier pieces. Like the chest is, I think, Spirit Haste rather. And if you get a couple of these Spirit Haste or Crit Haste pieces, you can get the first Rem break point and make that haste less bad. So not like super straightforward stuff here for Celestials. You can kind of just send it on whatever. As long as the pieces you equip primarily have critical strike on them and you're getting that spirit break point for hidden expertise. So it's a little bit of a silver lining here that we have such bad set bonuses that we don't have to go back and farm these in Celestials. If you're already geared, you already have like some normal, some heroic eye level pieces from Raid, completely unnecessary to go back into Celestials to farm lower eye level tier just to complete the set bonus. Alright, so last and sort of least-ish, we have Shaman. Shaman set bonuses are very similar to Mistweaver in that they're like pretty bad and very low impact. So the 2-piece here is going to be 10% mana cost reduction of Greater Healing Wave. This is like okay-ish for fights where you're going to be doing more focused tank healing, but it's just very low impact. And the 4-piece is similarly very low impact. It makes our Tidal Waves grant an additional 5% haste, okay-ish, doesn't increase the healing, and an additional 5% crit on Healing Surge. So this does increase the Healing Surge, but not like hugely significantly, and Healing Surge is such a small percentage of our healing that this, again, is very, very low impact. Meaningfully here, the Elemental 2-piece actually does benefit us, which just increases our Lightning Bolt damage. This is relevant because the Elemental pieces are actually better itemized. And I do think in our Biz setup, you're probably running 2-piece Elemental and like not too much healer tier. And I think you even might run 3-piece Elemental if you don't have the off helm from Shekzir. The Elemental Helm is like probably your second best option there. So if you look at the set bonus value, again, 10% on GHW is just a 10% increase in its efficiency. So if you're not pressing the spell too much, it doesn't really affect you. But if you are pressing the spell significantly, it's going to be a very small healing increase. The 4 set is 5% crits, about a 6% efficiency increase on Healing Surge, which is relatively decent. And obviously the 5% haste on GHW has 0 effect on throughput. So what does this mean for our Pre-Bis gearing specifically? Well, similar to Mistweaver, we have very bad PvE and PvP set bonuses. The PvP set bonuses are totally useless. It's like Grounding Totem CDR and then Spirit Walker's Grace being your kick immunity. So for Pre-Bis gearing, what I would do with a fresh Shaman is I would just go into Celestials. I would get like Ellie chest and legs, and then I'd either get like Ellie tier for helm, or just whatever off pieces are available that have haste on them from the Celestial vendor. If you're willing to farm Conquest, you can also fill in any slots that don't have the 483 eye level stuff from Celestials with PvP gear with that has haste on it, but generally speaking, you can kind of just sit in Celestials, farm some elemental tier pieces and some off pieces and be just fine. And similar to Mistweaver, the silver lining here is you do not have to go back into Celestials to farm lower eye level pieces just to complete those tier set bonuses. Alright, so that's the video. If you're a little bit disappointed here as a healer in these tier sets being kind of boring, don't worry, there's some more impactful and interesting ones coming, especially in Siege of Orgrimmar, but even in Throne of Thunder, they just really went insane with the gear. They made some insanely busted trinkets. The set bonuses get more powerful, and so I don't think you're going to be bored by gearing, definitely at all, in Mists of Pandaria, even though the tier set bonuses are not super exciting for healers. And, you know, healer tier being kind of boring is a problem they really don't solve for many, many years, many, many expansions. It's just kind of something that comes with playing healer, is that your tier set bonuses are usually kind of mid. If you enjoyed the video, you got some value, you know, like, comment, subscribe. I will be probably posting a video with the BIS list that I referenced in this video, so if you're interested in that, stay tuned. The healer BIS list is kind of a meme, but I think worthwhile to go through what I'd run on most of the healers. It might differ a little bit from the Wowhead stuff, just because I valued stats a little bit differently and probably undervalue the tier set more than they do. Something to be said there. Again, thanks for watching. See ya.
Swobu, Zug Zug.